Tonight, we stir up demons with a twist. Nathaniel Gillis is a religious demonologist and author. After living in a haunted house, Nathaniel spent 20 years researching what he encountered. Nathaniel is the founder of preternatural epiphenomenal philosophy. Say that 3 times fast. Nathaniel has sought to redefine the nature of haunting phenomena, ghosts, and high strangeness. He's often quoted for his concept of the demonic. Like this quote, "The reason they are playing by different rules is because they're playing a different game." Now, when you're dealing with demons, chances are flies are sure to be around. Okay, that's an awkward transition to a product pitch, but if you've seen the Amityville Horror, you kind of sort of get it. Last spring, I had a fly problem, and I don't mean the fly on my trousers. I mean house flies. Finally, I realized I had to deal with it myself. I put up sticky fly traps and a concoction with vinegar to lure flies to their death inside my home. I caught about a half dozen flies, but that wasn't nearly enough. Then I got smart, and I decided to kill flies outside of my home rather than wait for them until they got inside my home. The solution? A disposable fly trap by Rescue. Cut a hole, add water, and tie it up outside your home, and within hours, it's a fly massacre. After 30 days, replace it. Rescue gives you 2 disposable fly traps, or you can order even more. So, if you want to get rid of flies, click the affiliate link in the show notes. Sure, I may get a commission, but you won't pay a cent more, and your fly problem will be solved. And then, you'll only have demons to contend with, which is why you want to listen to tonight's show with religious demonologist Nathaniel J. Gillis.
In a world where nothing is known, nothing is certain, reality is not real. Wake up! Be afraid of nothing. I'm Bob Heskey.
Robert.
The host with the ghost.
This is my podcast, based on my paranormal documentary, Afraid of Nothing. Each episode, we talk to people who see life and the afterlife through a different lens. Join me.
Who is this large man? And what's he doing in our bedroom?
As we lift the veil and open our minds to see beyond our eyes lie. This is Afraid of Nothing.
Tonight, we have a special guest, demonologist Nathan Gillis, who has a unique take on the devil, demons, and unclean spirits with a twist about people who are abducted. So, Nathan, thank you very much for being on the show. Great to have you.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Excellent. You know, you define yourself as a religious demonologist. What's your religious background and what are your religious beliefs today? You know, exactly what do you believe in after all the experiences that you've had?
It's a good question. I grew up in Pentecostalism. And so my first taste of the deliverance ministry and spiritual warfare was by virtue of different people that would come through my church and they would perform their version of exorcisms and their version of deliverance ministry. But I left that culture and that movement when I was 18 years old. And since then, I'm kind of, I don't know, in some ways I've evolved into a deeper relationship with God. In other ways, I've evolved into a greater relationship and devolved outside of the dogma that I grew up in. And so now I look at everything that I've experienced through life, everything, especially within the framework of spiritual warfare. You know, I think that what I was taught regarding demons, demonology, and ghosts, it no longer fit the blueprint of my own experiences. And so since leaving that movement for the last 20 years, last at least 10, 15, I've been researching the origins of, unclean spirits, what the Bible says and what other religions, especially what other monotheistic religions have to say on the subject. And so that's what really led me to this research. And a lot of my views have changed. And I'm sure we'll get into that here shortly.
Yeah, most definitely. I've interviewed on like probably 75 episodes. I had a show that you were on, Duo Demonology, with James Andito and Carl Johnson. Were on them a little while ago. There's a guy who wrote a book about he's a psychologist that Catholic priests send people who are supposed to be possessed to. So I've talked to a shaman. I've talked to a wide range of people. How do you approach? I mean, you collect data, so you're into the data behind the demonology. But before we go into that, how do you approach if someone contacts you and they believe they're possessed? How does that work with you?
Well, I would ask them, okay, why did they believe that? I get on a Zoom call or at least a phone call, and I look for what I call symptoms. What you see manifestations? Do you have evidence of possession, scarifications on the skin? And, the case studies vary person to person, but usually most of the time it's people think they have a possession, and it's usually misidentified with some kind of psychological disorder. And so I kind of fall on the same line of thinking that Anito and Johnson respectfully do as well, where I just send them off and say, okay, I want to make sure, that this isn't some kind of psychological issue. Not that those are lesser of an evil or anything. It's just, I don't want to misdiagnose and mistreat. And we've seen throughout history evidence and case studies of people who had something going on psychologically, and the church kind of really abused them, thinking that they really actually had a demon on their hands. And so that's really what I kind of do. From there, the steps just kind of progress to whatever I think is necessary.
Do you have psychic ability? So if you're talking to someone on Zoom, are you able to kind of read into them the demonic activity, or do you have to kind of be in person with people?
No, there's been times when I had one case study. There's a gentleman that called me from out of town, and I said, he was younger, and I asked the mother, I said, well, if I'm going to help you, I said, just make sure not to lie. I said, I don't really like being lied to. I said, because it wastes both of our time, and I think it's just not a good thing to do for us to move forward. And so I said, so I'm going to ask you a question. I asked her, I said, okay, is suicide running your family? And she said, no. I closed my eyes and I said, okay, then who am I seeing? I said, I'm on a couch right now. And I said, I'm in your house, like in a psychic way. And I said, it's almost like it's nighttime. And I see an apparition of a tall white male with a black beard walk into a room. Who is that? And she kind of freaked out. And she said, well, that's my ex-husband, David. I said, who is he? She said, well, he killed himself. I said, well, I asked you, why didn't you tell me? Well, and that kind of, so sometimes that happens. I'm not saying it happens all the time or most of the time, but there are specific cases where the gifts that I have, I should say, sometimes curses, the gifts that I have will operate and help me, kind of guide me in a certain situation.
Yeah, it seems like everybody lies to a demonologist. It's like that, no, we didn't use the Ouija boards. Oh, no, we did nothing. It just manifested. You kind of almost have to be a sleuth and pull it out of them. You've talked about, I've listened to you on several podcasts. You are almost self-taught in this because growing up, you said you met your darkest entity. And I know you do this a lot when you're a guest on shows, but would you mind sharing your childhood, kind of your experience when you moved into a house and you saw the little girl and then weird stuff started happening?
Yeah, for sure. So I always tell people I was 8.5 years old because when you're that young, the halves matter. So I was 8.5, you know what I mean, brother? I was 8.5 on the Lord's Day. No, I was 8.5 years old, and my parents said, they said, get in the car, we're going to go look at this house, and we're thinking of buying it. And so I was all excited and everything, and so we walk in the front door, we're kind of looking around, and my dad leads me into this big room, and he says, okay, if we actually buy this house, this is going to be your room. So kind of look around and figure out where you're going to put your bed and your Nintendo 64 and all that. And while I was doing that, and I still cannot tell you why, but I felt led to just crawl on my knees, get on my knees and crawl over to this bed that was in the corner. And I could still remember pulling the blanket up that was hanging on the side of the bed. And when I did, I was met face to face with this little girl, full-body apparition. And I didn't know those things existed. I had no concept, no context about what was going on. And so I looked at her, she looked at me, and immediately she shimmied her body all the way up against the wall to where we were the furthest away from each other. I didn't say anything. Walked out of the room, and I thought for a second, is that a kid like that belongs in the neighborhood?
Yeah.
I didn't know if the realtor had left the door open and she snuck in. But there wasn't just the apparition. I can also remember that there was this pervasive stench in the room. It smelled like rotting organic matter. It's almost like decomposition. Once we moved into the house, that entity evolved into something far darker. And then it went from a little girl to shadow people to a smoky kind of a cloud that would ball up in the corner of my room at nighttime. And it gets even darker. I would go into nightmares, and the nightmare was the same nightmare over and over again. Nothing changed. And it always consisted of two young men sitting on a picnic table at a park. And one young man had a needle in his arm, which, again, I have no context of drugs or addiction at the time. None. Didn't know what it was. And so he was sitting there with the needle in his arm. He had his back towards me. And then his brother or his friend next to him, he turned around and he noticed that I was behind him. Next thing I know, he pulls out a black 357 Magnum, puts it in his mouth, and pulls the trigger. The nightmare ends, and it was just a constant thing. Like I said, it never changed. And so I would then wake up shaking, paralyzed in fear, and that entity, whatever or whoever it was in that room. It was what inspired that nightmare. And so since then, throughout my calling and throughout helping people, I am the most sensitive with suicide. I mean, I can call suicide in mid-sentence and then, you know what I mean, and deal with that entity. Yeah. And so I think that I had to go through all of that to get to where I am now, especially in my field.
So do suicides evolve into demons like that entity from your childhood?
We don't know, brother. It's a unique idea throughout history that there are certain people, be it suicide or tragedy or some form of trauma, that they do not die what ancient antique demonologists would call a good death. And so they believe that these individuals would become demons in the sense that they were earthbound, malevolent entities. And so that is one hypothesis that most demonologists in antiquity believed. Prior to even a lot of your scriptures in the Bible, that was the leading theory amongst people who study demons and their behavioral patterns. It wasn't until the 16th century when the Catholic demonology began to evolve that people started teaching that, okay, these were actually malevolent fallen angels. And that's when it kind of changed. And so that's where my research is couched at the moment. What are they? Who are they? And how do we fight?
You know, there's like what if scenarios, right? So say if I committed suicide and then I die, was it a demon that made me do it? And that demon stays behind in that room where you're at and I move on to the light? Or do I, because I committed suicide and I'm certainly unhappy with my existence, did I choose a darker path? I wonder which of those two it is. Do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, there is evidence to suggest that it's both. It's not either or. It's not a dichotomy. It's a duality. There's a researcher I know very well. I've been on his show who he watched his father commit suicide at a young age. And he was actually later on in life, he was in a seminary. And one of his teachers brought him to a live exorcism. And this guy he tells the story to this day. He says, I thought in my head, this is all baloney, until that person that was possessed looked at him, called him by name, and he spoke perfect Malay. Malay is a dead language, but he spoke perfect Malay. And in Malay, he said, hello, so-and-so. I was there when your father killed himself, and I made him pull the trigger. Mm. So
what is Malay? Where is it from? Do you know what part of the
I don't know. I don't know. I know it's Eastern. I think. I'm not really sure, but whatever it was really interesting too, because this gentleman said that at that time in his life, he had never heard of Malay either. And they did not tell him what the demon actually said to him until he had graduated and was an adult outside of the seminary. Then they set him down and said, okay, do you remember what happened 4 years ago? He said, yeah, this is what he said. So what's really unique about that situation and that case study, and it's not just that the entity knew where to strike the most, right? It wasn't, he didn't say, hey, I know you're a big fan of Cinnabon, right? Because that wouldn't have hurt him. Yeah. He literally plucked a memory out of his mind and used that against him. So to answer your question, I don't think anybody knows for sure if it is a demon or if it's just someone who had committed suicide. But the theory in antiquity, one of them was that there are people that when they do not die a good death, that not only are they earthbound, but they become mutated in their existence. And we do have evidence of that too throughout history.
What does mutated mean? Does that mean they're kind of split personalities and there are different realities, or what does that mean?
It's almost as if all of their negative traits are heightened. That's one of the leading theories. But again, we don't know for sure. We do have textual evidence, especially in the Bible in Psalms 109 and 6, where David it's called the curse text, and rabbis and scholars alike have a problem with it because it just kind of messes with their theology. But David is referring to one of his enemies, and David tells Yahweh, God, he says, I want you to place over that man. He said, I want you to place over him a wicked man. And that word wicked is rasha, and it's the Hebrew word for not just evil or wicked, that's the Hebrew word for possession. And so that we have textual evidence just right there that there are unclean spirits or there are ghosts that at least David believed that can actually possess a person. And I think that more often than not, especially with outside of Catholic demonology, you get like into Kabbalistic demonology and exorcistic rites, it's very clear that at least some of these beings are people who've lived and died. They share the same memories. They share the same trauma. They share the same belief systems. And I think that's one of the markers that led me to study these different theories. But yeah, so those are the two leading theories. It's either a fallen angel or there's someone who had lived and died and they didn't become better for it. They became worse.
Now, you seem like a self-taught person. What kind of amazes me about you is, from what I can tell, like I just kind of glossing over the surface, but it seems like you started it was a spiritual belief. Then that became false, like Santa Claus wasn't who you thought it was. But then you reevaluated it and you saw it through a different lens, right? And you had a different understanding, deeper understanding of it. So kind of curious about how that evolved. And also how long you started off at 8.5. How long did you have to deal with the dark entities and the shadow entities? And when was the apex where it got to its worst? And how did it, like, did you just move and it stayed there? Or how did it kind of...
No. Okay, let's go down that area for a second. So I lived in that house from 8 to 12, I think it was. Yeah, then I moved to another place. But so what happened with that entity is it kept like showing up in my room at nighttime. It felt like for some reason when the sun was out, I can't explain this one other than it would be nocturnal, I don't know. But when the sun was out, it wasn't as present. But when that sun set and the darkness began to cast this draconian shadow over me, it came with it. I mean, it was really terrifying. I mean, I would go to bed at night and I would hear something walking on my wooden floor, like displacing its weight and creaking. And so finally one night I could feel it next to me. It was almost like it was, I always tell people in demonology, it's present with but absent from at the same time. Yep. It's there looking at you, and it also wants you to feel seen. Very unique situation. But there was one night when I just got tired of it. I had failed a grade in school. I was, at that time, I was staying up all night, and then I would crash at school. And so it got to a point after seeing things, hearing disembodied voices above my head, talking to each other, and just these, various manifestations. Finally, I just walked into the bathroom, shut the door, and crawled up in the fetal position in the corner of the room, and I could feel it into the bathroom. And I just said, God, I don't know what this is. I don't know who this is. I said, I just know that I can't do this anymore. And quite literally, it was just almost like a light turned on. It just, that spirit completely dissolved into nothingness. And then I never felt it the same way again. Now, I can identify that type of spirit now, but there's a teaching within Pentecostalism and the deliverance ministry. What God delivers you from, he gives you dominion over.
Did your family members or siblings feel or see what you went through? Did they think you were an odd kid? Did they believe you?
Well, I had some unique gifts going on at the same time. I mean, I could, bilocation in a sense has always been with me. I could be talking to you right now, and then I could close my eyes and I could just be somewhere else and know what's happening at another location. And so they knew that whatever was going on with me, that it was supernatural. And, it was really funny you mentioned that, because the very last day when we were moving out of the house, my dad pulls me aside and said, listen, he's like, I never thought you were crazy, which he never told me that either, right? He never did think I was crazy. He knew what was going on, but he said, he said, every time I would walk in that house, it felt like somebody died in it. So yeah, right. That's how I got into this field. I wanted to understand the stench that I smelled, because I was the only one that could smell it. My parents couldn't smell it. My friends couldn't smell it. My cousins couldn't smell it. And so I wanted to know, okay, is it actually something that stinks in here? Is there a dead mouse? Or, is there like mold? And then it wasn't until I started uncovering these ancient manuscripts that, hey, listen, early demonologists called that the stench of consciousness. They believe that these ghosts carry the stench of the corpse they left.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
This is an Afraid of Nothing Paranormal Podcast Alert.
$10 merch. $10 merch.
That's right, podcast fans. If you go to our website, afraidofnothingpodcast.com, and click on the store tab, you too can find now $10 merch on the website. So not only can you get the great stuff like the hoodies and the t-shirts and the blankets and the glasses, you can also get stickers and bumper stickers and, well, a whole lot more. You need to see it yourself. But just remember this.
$10 merch
is now available at the Afraid of Nothing podcast store. Check it out. And remember, never be afraid to look good.
Now, do you think your research is a matter of you uncovering stuff, being self-taught, or do you think it's something you knew in a prior life and are rediscovering, or do you think this is the first time you're learning it?
I don't know. Honestly, I don't know. I know people have wanted me to do like life regressions and whatnot. I'd be very interested in that, because there are situations that I've been in that I shouldn't have known what to do.
Yeah.
Names of people that I would come up with. I had a guy that reached out to me about an entity that was affecting his daughter. I went into some kind of trance, and I said, okay. I said, just bear with me. I said, I see your ex-wife, her mother. I said, I see her as a child, your daughter's age, and her father shutting the door at nighttime and unspeakable things. And I said, and that entity is affecting your daughter. And that's the reason he called me. I said, who is Emma? Guy started crying. He says, oh my God. He goes, that's my daughter. That's her age. And you're exactly right. That's exactly what happened with her mother. And I said, okay. So a lot of this literally in discerning spirits is not just knowing the future and what's going to happen if you do this, say this, but it's also interpreting the past. Where did this entity arrive first? Do we have to cancel this curse? And all these different possibilities, but I shouldn't have known that.
Wow. Correct me if I misstate this, but I think it was kind of interesting. In one of the podcasts you're on, you talked about most people just react to like a haunting, like the effect, the residue of a haunting. It's kind of like, having a headache and taking a pill to get rid of the headache. But what's causing the headache is it a lack of caffeine or whatever. But you kind of look at it, like the demon or the entity that has a consciousness itself. So don't look at just what they're doing to the experience that the person has, but what is the consciousness of the entity, correct? Is something along that lines, or
100%. Yeah. So a lot of us, there's a reason why the earliest demonologists were your first physicians, right? And so they would have to discern, is this the cause or is this the symptom? And right. So a lot of times, especially within exorcistic rites throughout history, a lot of people, it didn't matter if you were a priest or a rabbi or an imam, a lot of them were treating the symptom and leaving the disease. And so that's why ancient demonologists and exorcists would tie the symptom to a disease and cast out the disease as if it was a demon, right? And so if you get rid of the disease, all of the symptoms go with it.
Yeah.
But I think that's an interesting approach to it.
You look at the data behind demonology. How do you gather data like that? I mean, do you have a mentor? Do you figure it out as you go, or how do you do your research, and how do you build on your knowledge base? Well, it includes my experiences. It includes some of the teachings that I grew up in. But,
the things that I were told about these entities, they weren't exactly true. Like, for instance, especially in evangelicalism, we're taught that these are fallen angels. And then when I started getting into the D-Book literature in the 16th century, why didn't anybody tell these entities they were fallen angels? Because they had memories, they had belief systems. You know, there were people that were being possessed, and the ghosts inside them were solving their own murders. And so why would a fallen angel do that? Why would he go lock up a murderer? None of it made sense to me. So the more I dug, the more I started being mentored by different rabbis, different people, because my dad's a Bible scholar. And so when I was growing up, I had access to Hebrew teachers, rabbis, and different rabbinic ideas. But so that's when it kind of all fell apart for me, because I knew that the phenomenon itself was stretching itself bigger. Yeah. It wasn't just, okay, there's horns and hooves. Well, sometimes it's Becky. You know, and so I think that's really important, especially within, exorcisms.
It blows my mind how you know where to look. I have a hard time finding something to watch on Netflix, but for you to know where to look, to do your research or to find it, it sounds like you've checked in a lot of places in deep crevices, and it seems like you've found, threads of truth, but it's been up to you, your mind, to kind of weave them together to what the truth is that makes sense to you, which I think a lot of people struggle with in this life is, what is true? And it seems like you're really on a journey finding that, but with a dark side too to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I always tell people I cling to the data. I don't like the dogma. The dogma is, throughout history, the dogma has just been in like descriptions of these beings. That's really what it is. And so a lot of, especially demonologists, they get caught up in interpretations. So what I've learned to do is I kind of sit down, I say, okay, I don't care what it looks like. What does it do? Right? What is it doing? Is it an incubi? Well, why do we call it an incubi? It's not that an incubi is an actual person. It's a species. And then the deeper I got into the research, it wasn't even a species. It was a program, right? And so once you start getting into the literature, it becomes, I should say this, once you start getting enough literature in you, it becomes easier to spot the bloody footprints in the snow, that behavioral pattern's present. While these entities have changed, they've evolved according to our awareness of them, that can all be true. But at the same time, what they've been doing throughout history is the same. It has not changed. And so I look for the behavioral patterns.
How is consciousness of a demon different than the consciousness of a human? It seems like it'd be heavier or a different type of substance. Is it different? Or?
Yeah. Well, yeah, if we're going into what's called classical systematic demonology, yes, the idea would be that there is something heavier. It's more malevolent. It has knowledge about you that you never gave it. It has the ability to transcend space and time. It can read your mind. It can manipulate reality, all that. And yet I've encountered entities that were just disembodied souls that had the ability to do that. And I think that throughout history, what a lot of demonology has done is they've kind of lumped these two existences together, just like Psalms 109:6. That text includes two entities. Number one, it includes the possessing entity, the Rasha, and then it includes a Satan in there as well. That one scripture is what splintered into the two dominating schools of thought and demonology. Catholicism being, it's the Satan, it's a demon, right? And Kabbalah being, it's a disembodied soul. And so, yes, to my knowledge, I believe they are one and the same. I don't believe I'm going to categorize them as differently. Now, what I mean by that is this. It's really interesting. They can all be of the same substance, but you can have entities that are not of the same status. And I think that's what we're talking about right now.
Do demons have a purpose, or are they just here with their own agenda?
Well, the early church taught that they didn't have a purpose, just to haunt people and destroy humanity, right? The demon hates, it eats, it kills, it murders. And yet that's not really what we're dealing with. I mean, we're dealing with a certain pathology here. We're dealing with entities that have their own victimology. They have their own belief systems. Matter of fact, Father Sinistrari of Amino, he's a Franciscan priest. He talks about this. And he said that he was on a dirt road one day praying and fasting when a demon materialized to him. And he said this was a demon that did not obey any religious text. And this is a very educated priest here. And so he quoted the Quran, didn't obey it. He quoted the Torah, did not obey it. He quoted the Holy Bible, didn't obey it. And so this led Father Sinastrari of Amino to literally, this is very strange, he called it a pagan demon.
A what demon? Could you repeat that again, Nathaniel?
Yeah, he called it a pagan demon.
Pagan demon, okay.
Which I thought religion defines demons.
Yeah.
How can a demon know? Like, how can a demon actually pick and choose which religion he believed in? So once we start getting into the data, a lot of this dogma falls apart in our hands. And I think for us to be good researchers and honest researchers, it should, right? That's how we evolve.
Yeah, a good chunk I'd like to talk going forward is about the Multers. You know, this kind of scares the crap out of me, I'll be honest. The idea of taking your soul, because I worry about losing a soul and not getting it back. But let's talk about people and alien abductions and the implants and the soul hunter. I know I've kind of given a wide, I've just thrown it out there like all the ingredients on the kitchen table. But talk about how in demonology, how it gravitated toward alien abductions and how you found a connection there.
Yeah, so going along the same thought that some of these beings are people, that have body or used to be embodied, used to have body. There was a certain species of demon that is written about in the texts, especially in the Holy Bible. This species of demon literally wants to be embodied again. And so what it started doing is it first started to possess statues. That's why in the book of 2 Chronicles, Yahweh speaks about this very interesting. He says, he that is impoverished seeketh out an artificer of metal. And so what our ancestors used to do, at least that part of the world, they would create a statue in the image of this entity. It was almost as if that was his body. And then the consciousness of that entity would merge with the metal. And now it had an image. That mutated. It's very interesting, too. And this is another connection to the UFO abduction phenomenon. That mutated into what's called a teraphim ritual. It's a ritual of necromancy. And so what these idolaters in the late Iron Age, which is the Old Testament, what they would do is instead of creating a piece of or a statue of metal, they would go get a piece of metal, a small piece of metal, and they would carve the name of that entity into the metal. What they believed, the consciousness of that entity would merge with the metal. Then what they would do is they would go find a body, hollow implant, and then they would implant that piece of metal into that body. And the consciousness of that entity would stretch out into the skin of that individual. And so if you see just right here in a fleeting moment, they evolved from possessing statues to actually having a fleshly body again. These are what I call the Multers.
Could you educate us quickly on one thing which we should know, but for those who don't, necromancy? What is that? You mentioned that term. Yes, that is
it's a practice of divination. But one practice of that form of divination, which necromancy is conjuring up a spirit that is deceased and placing it into a body or into an object. That's one ritual, and that was what these people were literally doing. And so throughout history in the Old Testament, we see this over and over again. And what happened with us, especially in the first century and beyond, is we thought that these were fallen angels, right? That's what we were taught, at least I was. It wasn't until I got a hold of the Torah that I started realizing that most, if not all, of the demoniacs in the New Testament were performing necromancy. And so that gave me the context as to what these entities possessing people were. But those are the Multers. Those are entities that will use a body until the body's done, and then they will leave that body and possess someone else.
Do we do it to ourselves? Do demons seduce us, but we have to make the statue, do the metal piece, and have it insert our body, or are they in control? Are they in control of the possession, or are we?
Oh, God. Good question. Well, by the time it's possession, the reason we call it possession is because the person is no longer able to determine who is thinking
obsession,
for them. Right. And so early on, like, Catholics call it obsession. At that period, I call it an exterior entity. At that point, it's almost like a new heart being placed into a new body. That heart is stretching itself to the nervous system, looking to see if it's accepted or not, right? And then what it does, I've seen this happen in real life, that entity will give this person a thought, and this person will reject it. And then that entity will give them the same thought over and over again until that person agrees with that entity. And once you have an agreement, you start having what's called covenant. And sooner or later, next thing that entity's going to do is he's going to give you a thought that you will no longer recognize as the entity. You'll believe it's you. And when you do that, you'll start acting on it. And that's when we have murders and suicides occur.
Wow. Now, jumping to soul hunters, because that thought kind of scares me. And I want to, the whole alien abduction thing. Can you talk about take us from they think they've been abducted, they got a piece of metal in them, and tell us about the soul hunter and how that kind of works. And because I'm interested in how demons can actually, I didn't know that. You hear different people say different things. They can't take your soul, they can only possess you. But I think you believe that there's a soul hunter that can take your soul. And do they collect souls? And does that, I'm going to ask, I'm kind of going all over the place, but one, can they take it? Can you ever get it back? Are you unable to have an afterlife if they take your soul? What happens?
These are big questions. I'll tell you what the data suggests. In the book of Ezekiel chapter 13, Yahweh calls these entities soul hunters. It was a species of necromancy, rather a species of necromancers. And what these individuals were doing is they were killing people to save themselves. It's in Ezekiel chapter 13, but he calls the very unique situation here. He says, I have something against you, those who hunt the souls of men to make them fly. Now, this whole idea of the bird soul is seen mostly throughout Eastern antiquity. It first originated in Egyptology when they said that there's a ghost that leaves the body at the moment of death and it flew away like a bird. And so throughout history, we have different monotheistic religions that taught that. It didn't matter what God they believed in. They all had this theology about the soul that included that there's this ball of light or something that leaves the body and flies. And so that's why, like in Psalms 91, David mentions this, the snare of the fowler. He talks about this often. But to be clear, that's the soul that Yahweh is referring to in Ezekiel 13. And so that's the behavioral pattern. That's the marker. It wasn't until I started getting into the UFO abduction phenomenon that I realized, hey, guys, Yahweh wasn't making this up. There are entities that are using people and manipulating reality and actually causing people to become self-seeing. So what that means, there are cases you can look at a UFO, blink your eye, and now you're looking at yourself, looking at the UFO. And so there's a distinction here between the body and the soul. I'm going to finish this real quick. And I believe 100% that's why Yahweh said, don't fear the one who can kill just the body. He said, fear also the one that can kill the body and the soul.
So does that mean if your soul is taken, you're damned forever and you're in possession of these demons? Does that mean you don't have an afterlife and your consciousness, and love and the
That's a good question. It's a good question. I mean, we do have case studies. One is Whitley Strieber, and there's a host of other cases where people have been abducted and have seen deceased family members. They've seen deceased friends. And so that's what's really interesting about this, because there are certain abductions that fall into the characteristic of it being an out-of-body experience or a near-death experience. So that's a very unique take on it, but that also lends the idea that these beings are not what we would consider fallen angels, at least in the Western theological term, that whatever these entities are, that they're out of body and they exist whatever we would call the afterlife.
So it sounds like humans have it better than we realize, because we have these demons that want our body, they want our soul, and we probably don't realize the gifts that we have. Is that accurate?
Yes, absolutely. They're plucking out of us the thing that we're most ignorant of, right? Nobody goes out there and says, hey, listen, I took a picture of a soul and I know the ins and outs of it, the data and all that. We don't. We don't even understand what dimension the soul exists in. Does it have a weight to it? Does it not? So I think that's the most disturbing aspect of my research is they're not just taking people's bodies, they're taking their souls. And matter of fact, there's a Betty Luca case, Betty and Bob Luca. Bob Luca woke up in the middle of the night to watch his wife's apparition fly out the window. And it wasn't just his experience. Betty Luca remembered looking at her body. So what I think is happening right now is the conversation in demonology is changing, and it should change. We need to start re-examining our once held dogmas, and we need to evolve into new held datas because the blueprint's no longer fitting. Whatever these beings are, I know for sure Yahweh's mentioned them, but he's mentioned them in the Eastern context. not in this first century Greek Orthodox Western theology. And so I think if we want to go deeper, we've got to go further back.
How far are you in your research? Are you just like in chapter 1? And who do you sit down with for coffee that's kind of is in your same mindset that you go back and forth with?
There's a rabbi in Brooklyn I call from time to time. I have enough manuscripts, enough documents, and I have worked enough cases to know what I'm looking for. You know what I mean? Like I said, these entities don't do anything different. They're always trying to implant fetuses into people and women and take the fetus. They're always trying to use memories against us. It's the same behavioral patterns. The modus operandi has not changed, but what's happened, especially in theology and the field of ufology, is what we've considered aliens in antiquity considered demons. And so I think for us to evolve into greater dimensions of thought, we have to take the dogma glasses off and we have to unite both. Yesterday's demons are today's aliens. I guess that's the biggest contribution I've been able to give demonology at this point, is to say, hey, listen, we do have ancient case studies that fit the blueprint of modern abductions. And if that's the case, it's our responsibility as researchers to understand this phenomenon more.
What advice would you give to someone? Look, it seems like you can't protect yourself about being abducted, but is there any advice or guidance you give to someone to shield themselves as much as they can to have a good, pure life and to leave this world intact?
Yeah, that's it. Have a good, pure life. Have a good, pure life. I don't recommend Ouija boards. I tell people that's like going out there and looking for Uncle Ted. Some other Ted comes in you might not like. And so, these entities will impersonate the deceased. And these entities will just use that as a hook to gain more and more influence. And there's a lot of people that always ask me, who do you call on during abductions? I'll tell you what, last year I quit researching for about a month. Here's why. Because once again, the blueprint of modern demonology doesn't fit anymore. I was looking at a case study that said that this lady had been abducted by these soul hunters before, felt them in her room. She knew she was going to be abducted. And so she started praying the Lord's Prayer. In the middle of a sentence, her eyes roll back in her head and they take her.
Have you ever been taken, Nathaniel? Have you ever been abducted?
I don't believe so. Not to that degree. I mean, I've had a dream before that was a really unique dream, but I can't say that I have. And yet the data suggests that there are people that have been abducted. They just don't know it yet.
Yeah.
So that's where we are.
One of the questions, the person that introduced me to you is a woman named Michelle Freed. She was actually the producer for Art Bell, Midnight in the Desert. And you're actually my first guest. She's helped me out with a bunch of guests. So she gave me a list of questions. One of them was under UFOs, what is forgotten consciousness? And I don't know what context I should ask you in that, but what is forgotten consciousness?
Well, that's the idea that the soul can exist outside of the body and experience real-time events as though it was in the body. Okay.
When we're alive,
yes.
astral projection and okay.
100%. It's a very unique situation. We still don't know the dimensions of it, what can happen, what can't happen. But Betty Luca and other abductees, experiencers, absolutely. Matter of fact, most of the time we had case studies of people who thought they were in their body during their abduction until they become physical again. And then they realize, wait a minute, I was experiencing life in real time out of my body the same way and with the same senses that I was when I was in the body. So I think that's the forgotten consciousness. It's that part of us that exists outside of the body and it experiences that world just like we do experience this one.
So a good thing is if you can leave your body and travel somewhere else. A bad thing is if you wake up and see your body looking down at you, right? Basically.
Yes. And that's happened before. I have a good friend of mine. He's in Massachusetts. He's a researcher. I did one show and he reached out to me and said, dude, I got to tell you my story. I said, okay. He's like, do you know how I got into this field? I said, I have no idea. You've never told me. And I knew enough about his research and his shows. He's never told anybody on a show, I don't believe. So I said, what happened? He said, man, I was like 9 or 10 years old. He said, I was very sick. He said, I was having a health crisis. And he says, I got so sick. He said, I went like into a dream state. And he said, next thing I know, I'm looking down at my body. Oh. And he said, this is trippy, but this is occurring more than you think it is, or not you in general, like not you, but you in general, people. Yeah. It happens all the time. He said that I looking down at my body, and he said, next thing I know, something goes into my body and it looks right at me. He said, so I'm looking down at my face. And that's what I mean when I do these lectures. And I say that these beings, they can trigger a self-seeing experience.
How did he
It's pretty
feel? Was he
terrifying.
frightened? Did he?
Oh my God, yeah. Because
Was he conscious? Was he conscious
Yes.
looking up at himself, conscious looking at him, like kind of like you see the
No.
horror movies sometimes, or is it?
Okay, first of all, the reason he had reached out to me is because I was doing a lecture on the Nephilim and talking about how the Ammonites went into Canaan and how that these entities had a language of necromancy. They were called Zamzumim, and Zamzumim was not a concrete title. It just, the word itself has a Z sound. It's a buzzing sound. And the reason they named these entities that is because that's what their language sounded like. And so the reason he contacted me, he says, dude, he says that buzzing, chirping language, he said, whatever entity had possessed my body, it looked right up at me. He said, and we met each other's gaze. He said, and it began to speak to me in that buzzing language that is mentioned in the Bible as necromancy. He said, that's why I want to tell you the story. So there are a lot of interesting anecdotal references there, but yeah, so they can call self-seeing events. They can trigger bilocation in us where you are in two places at the same time.
Were you able to help this guy, Nathaniel? Well, why did he tell you this story? Did he just want to just know that he's not insane, that this happens, or were you able to help him with anything? Or
well, one thing that's really, this is how you know you're on the right track, is when you don't really tell anybody some of the data you're collecting, and then you start, when somebody really hears it for the first time, it hits them and they say, oh my God, that happened to me too. Right. That's what he said. And so he's like, he's older than I am. I think he's like 55 now. And he just wanted to get a hold of me and let me know, hey, listen, you're on the right track. And I wasn't using, modern UFO studies. I was pulling that right out of Ezekiel 13. Right. Those who hunt the souls of men to make them fly. Right. So you have the body and you have the soul. They're taking the soul. And so that's how you know you're on the right track. Those kind of markers are like lighthouses in the darkness. You are exactly where you're supposed to be.
So you've looked at a lot of different religious texts. What's your go-to one to help you with it? Is it the Quran? Is it the Bible, the New Testament? What is there? What is your, or is it all of them?
Well, I think that the Kabbalistic tradition with Isaac Luria and Hayim Patel, I think that added the most value to me as a researcher. Because like I said, what was happening in the 16th century, you had Isaac Luria and Hayim Patel. Their teachings they were in a province in Israel called Safti, and they were teaching that these beings, at least some of them, were the departed. And like I said, they were having case studies. Watch this, is very interesting too, if you're listeners. In the 16th century, they had women that were not only being possessed by these beings, but they were being impregnated by them as well. And so we had these individuals going to the exorcists and literally showing as if they're with child. And then once the exorcism was done, about two or three months later, the fetus that they implanted was gone too. Well, we now know that in the 21st century as the missing fetus syndrome. Right?
Yeah.
They knew that in that text as a form of possession and later on as also a form of pregnancy. But it's important for research to understand that because it's not a modern phenomenon. It is ancient. This has been going on for a long time.
Why would they want a human fetus and a soul? Wouldn't they want one or the other? Wouldn't the soul be much better than a human fetus? Wouldn't they seem like two different objectives?
Yeah, to a degree there is. So throughout history, we've had beings, especially in Genesis 6, the Nephilim and the Rephaim, where they were performing what's called the red rite. And in sorcery, the red rite teaches that when one of these magi or magicians, sorcerers in antiquity, whenever their body was dying, and for those who want to reference this, it's out of James Frazier's book, The Golden Bow. Whenever their body was dying, they would willingly dispossess it. And then they would go find a female, a woman, to impregnate. And this is what we demonologists would call this the incubus, but we did not know where it originated, right? That's why I call it a program. Yeah. It's not a person, it's a program being worked on people. Anyways, they would create a love bond with this woman, and then they would fertilize her and inseminate her, and then they would create a fetus. And the whole purpose of creating the fetus was to possess it.
Isn't that funny? It's
body.
like a test tube baby, rather than have to go through the hassle of possessing. So I'll create my own farm of fetuses and possess them there. Interesting. Oh,
it's a way of self-replicating. So what I did, is I research a lot of stuff very deep, and I have an insatiable desire to understand it more. But if you look at Genesis 6, it's very vague. It's ambiguous. How could the sons of God take wives of men? Why would they want that? And so what ancient moralists wrestled with was, how could they be attracted to flesh if they're fallen angels? It wasn't until I got a hold of an ancient manuscript called the Apocrypha of John that it kind of set everything in motion. It said that these beings manifested to women in the images of their husbands. That's this red right we're talking about, right? It created a relationship, a love bond, and then it implanted a fetus. And then the red right said, and especially the Apocrypha of John, and then it would step into the fetus and possess it. And so that's a whole nother show, but that's really where it led me. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing now in the context of the missing fetus syndrome.
So, all right, we're going to wrap up just a couple more questions. Demons, are they like people? Are there like a wide range of different races of demons? Some are the molters, some are whatever, taking fetuses, or is a demon a demon a demon?
I think it's the latter, and I think it's very unique in terms of what we're dealing with. I mean, sure, there are entities that are like the D-Book, which are people that just, they're disembodied, and their afterlife is not exactly what they wanted it to be. And, some of them are murdered, and so they would possess people to solve their own murders. But that's not necessarily a molter. Earlier in the show, you asked me, okay, is there a difference in the presence of a ghost and a demon? I would say yes. When you're in the presence of a molter, it is 100% mutated. It's not just consciousness. It's much more powerful, and it has access to information that regular ghosts do not.
Oh. Sounds like a black hole of entities that would just totally swallow you up.
Yeah.
Okay. One more question, if you're like, is there one movie where you've watched or like, oh my God, somebody got inside my head and understands me? Is there one movie that you've seen where you thought it was great?
Yes. And it's probably not going to be what you guys think it'll be. It's Dark City.
Dark City. Okay.
Yep. Kiefer Sutherland's in it. And for the most part, it's exactly what we're dealing with. Controllers.
Is that kind of the animated one where it's kind of like, I'm thinking like Sin City, maybe, I guess, where it was kind of almost like,
No, that's Sin City. Yeah, this is Dark City, and it's old. It's really it's retro, but it's chilling, especially in the context of my research.
I'll have to look that up. Wow, Nathaniel, you've been great. I really appreciate it. Now, you've written a couple books. You've written one of them. I love the title is amazing. So, A Moment Called Man. That's very kind of philosophical. I love that. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that book. And then The Skin That Crawls is your other book. Want to give us just a brief blurb on each of these books and where they can buy them?
Yeah, A Moment Called Man is about. It was for my friend who had overdosed, and he was an empath. And so in that book, I talk about how a lot of empaths will medicate the gift they're called to manifest.
Yeah.
And then The Skin That Crawls is literally out of Ezekiel 13. And it's about, again, possession as it evolved throughout biblical antiquity. And the reason I call it The Skin That Crawls is because in Ezekiel 13, Yahweh makes a reference to these entities using an ancient form of skin grafting to create a body to possess. That's Yahweh, dude. He's a beast. So, yeah, those are the two books. And The Skin That Crawls, man, once I get that out, I want that to be, I want to be a motion picture, man. I would love that to be in the theater so I can really help people along with.
Yeah, the title alone, I could just see the poster art for that. Would be amazing. What type of people should reach out to you? Certain people you probably don't want to reach out to you, but what type of person should reach out to you and connect with you, and how should they do it?
Well, you can reach me on social media. I don't do cleansings or exorcisms anymore. I did that for a period, and it took a lot out of me. You know what I mean? It's not just love and light everywhere. So now I'm just more focused on research. So if, pictures, data, videos, if people have their own experiences. The other day I had, not too long ago, not the other day, but a bit longer than that, I had a lady that was haunted by an entity and it scratched her. And the scratches were subsurface. They were underneath the skin, and they pushed their way to the surface. And she had that would completely confirm my research. And so that's the kind of stuff I really like, that really furthers me and really helps me along.
So if a person is listening, like, oh man, finally someone I can share a story with that happened to me.
For sure.
That's the type of person that, now you're not necessarily going to go, cleanse them or anything, but you can at least provide context to what they're experiencing with your research and give them this context of it.
100%. When I said, furthers me, I'm not saying like my career or anything. No, it helps me with my research and helps me gain clarity in it. And like you said, that's the kind of messages I'm looking for. Even if you're an experiencer or an abductee, I would love to hear your story. And I'm very open to all these stories. I mean, I've helped families with the incubi cases, succubi cases. So I've heard a lot of stuff and I've seen a lot of stuff. Nothing surprises me anymore. So don't think you're alone.
So your website is www.n as in Nathaniel, J as in your middle name, I guess, Gillis, GILLIS.com, correct?
Yeah, I got to get that up again, man. It expired.
Is there some other way? Should they look for you on Facebook or LinkedIn or what else? Where else can they find you?
Yeah, man. I'm all over everywhere. I'm on Twitter now. I'm on YouTube. I am on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. That's the easiest way to get a hold of me. I'm always on social media. If I'm not posting, I'm looking at stuff. So that'll be the easiest
and you know
way.
what? I tend to post a lot of that on each guest, so they could also go to my website and look you up under my guest section and find ways to contact you there. So Nathaniel, thank you so much. Yeah, you're right. There could have been many different avenues. I've heard you on other shows, and you've gone down different levels and deep into your research in the Bible aspect. But thanks for staying the course with me tonight. I thought this was a great show, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for having me, guys. I hope you enjoyed it.
You've been listening to the Afraid of Nothing podcast. Please subscribe and like us on Facebook. Until next time, stay scared.
Hey, you're still here? Great. Then why not listen to another episode? Visit afraidofnothingpodcast.com to peruse all the shows. That's afraidofnothingpodcast.com. And while you're there, click the coffee cup icon to buy me a coffee and leave a review. I'll give you a shout out in an upcoming episode, and the world will know how swell you are.